Hi folks, Simon here. In this video, we're going to take a look at Azure Functions and getting started with them. And today we're going to just start simply by looking at the timer trigger, which is one of the many triggers that Azure Functions have that allow the actual functions to run based around various different scenarios that might happen in your code. So if you're not using Azure Functions and you're in the .NET space and you're using Azure, then you really are missing out because they're a fantastic tool that you can add to your arsenal. Now, if we jump over to Visual Studio, now I've got Azure Functions by default on my left here, but if you didn't have that, you can just search for Azure Functions, select that from your list. So we'll start our new project. We'll call this Azure Functions Getting Started, and we'll just leave the solution settings as they are. We'll click on Next. We'll select the latest version of .NET, in this case it's .NET 8, and we want to set up and start with a timer trigger. Now we'll leave the Use Azure Write ticked, and the schedule on the timer doesn't really matter at this point. We'll overwrite that and look at that in a minute. So we'll click on Create to create our Azure Functions project. All right, so our project has started up and it's taken us straight to our function number 1, which we will rename to timer. Okay, and we will just rename our function as well. Now, we'll just have a quick look at what's actually happening here. So we'll start with our program CS, where we create a host builder, we set up our defaults for the function application, we configure some services. By default, you get application insights configured, and then we build and run the app. Now, what happens at this point is that the application, the Azure Functions host, will go and look for all the functions that it finds in the application. So if we look at our timer.cs again, you can see that we've got this attribute called function that just has the name of timer. So that's the name of the actual function. So when we run the app in a minute, you'll see that that is what it's picking up on. Now, each Azure function has 3 primary types of data. The first is the trigger. Now that determines what actually causes the function to run. So some common triggers are the timer, like we're looking at today, HTTP, it can be a queue entry, it can be Azure Blob Storage, it could be Azure Service Bus, it can be Event Grid. There's about 30 different triggers. So through this series, we'll take a look at a number of those different triggers and learn about how each one works. The second type of data is an input attribute. So that is where you can define other resources that are being brought into the function that you can then use to work with within your function. The third is an output attribute, which determines what sort of data comes out of your function. Now, with a timer, it might be sending off a queue. It might make a HTTP request. It might run a report and email somebody, or it might just validate some data, in which case there wouldn't be any output. You don't necessarily have to have input and output bindings on your function, but you do need to have a trigger because that is how the function is actually triggered. So in this instance, we have a timer trigger, and it's run using a cron expression. A cron expression, it's a mechanism to determine intervals of time based around a certain set of criteria. So I'll just jump over to Edge. There's this article that I'll link to in the description of this video that is by a guy called Armin Reiter, I believe. I'm not sure how that's pronounced. Sorry, Armin. But this is a fantastic article. I've used this many times over the last few years, and it has a fantastic breakdown of how to build a cron expression for Azure Functions and heaps of examples. So you can see you can set every minute, every 5 minutes, hourly, there's so many different ways that you can configure different expressions. So, and it's all based around the fact that each of these little segments represents seconds, minutes, hours, days, months, and days of the week. We'll be just working with some really simple ones in this example, but I will link to that article in the description. The other thing I will link to is the Azure Functions documentation on learn.microsoft.com. This is a fantastic resource for anything to do with, well, .NET in general or Azure in general. But for Azure Functions, it's fantastic as we can look at this triggers and bindings documentation to see all about how to use all these triggers and bindings. And if we just look down here, we've also got there's some information on the attributes. There is usage implementation information. There's cron tab expressions. And again, this sort of goes through what the other article goes through. This is their official documentation. Gives a few more examples. Now, there are some important bits of information, especially around time zones. So you'll note this information on the page. Time zone information is important if you need something to run at a specific time of day. So if it's every minute, then it doesn't matter what the time zone is. But if you want something to run at 6 p.m. local time to you, then you do need to configure the website time zone. Otherwise, it won't know. Or by default, it will run in the UTC time zone. So you would then need to set your cron expressions up to allow for whatever is, say, 6 p.m. in your local time zone. The other thing to note is that this website time zone setting doesn't work on Linux implementations in the consumption plan, only in the app service plan. So Azure Functions can be deployed in several different scenarios, one being serverless or a consumption plan, the other is to an app service plan, the other is to dedicated plans and that sort of thing. We'll go through more of those in another dedicated video. So I typically, for 99% of my Azure Functions, I'll deploy them to Windows on the consumption plan because it costs almost nothing and they're sort of self-sufficient, and then I can use that website time zone setting. So we'll jump back to the code. You'll see this is set to run every 5 minutes because the first parameter is the seconds, the second is the minute. So the */5 is every 5 minutes. So if we were to remove the /5, this would then run every minute. Okay, and you can see now, and you can see that it's just running the logger to output the next execution. Now that next execution is actually the current execution. So it's a little bit confusing in the terminology. Next doesn't mean the preceding one, the one coming up next. It means the next one from when this was scheduled, which is this execution, which is a little bit confusing, but as long as you realize that, that's fine. So we can just run this now. And you can see now that our function app has run, you can see that it has come up with the timer trigger. It's got a host lock lease acquired, which it has to do before it can run any of the functions. So now it's just a matter of waiting for the minute to pass, and on the minute, this first execution will run. So we'll just pause quickly while we wait for that. All right, that was only a few seconds. So you can see that this is run now, and we can see that it's run at 2:32 p.m. So that will then run at 2:33 p.m., etc., etc. So that's running per minute. So if we shut it down now, that's the basics of the timer trigger. It all comes down to this cron expression. Now, what you can actually do as well is if we just cut that out and we put in a little variable, and we'll call this, say, timer parameter, and we can actually go into our local settings and we can actually set this in here. Timer parameter. So what this then allows us to do is, because these are configured in our configuration, we can change the cron expression for this specific timer in the configuration and then not have to redeploy our app. So if we were to save that and run that again, it would be exactly the same as running as you would see on if the expression was in here. That's just a general breakdown of setting up Azure Functions and using the timer trigger. So we'll go through in this series and look at each of the different timers and a number of the input and output parameters. So stay tuned and check. I'll put this video in a playlist so you can go through and watch the playlist of each of the different types. Thank you.